It's good to know that we make mistakes. It's something that this week I was reminded of. In the New Testament, when you read the New Testament, what you see over and over again is that the people that Jesus approached and invited to follow him, they were people who they were messed up. There were people that had messed up lives. Jesus went into circumstances and had conversations with people who had blown it, were in the middle of blowing it, over and over again. Like you see these people who they didn't believe the right things, they didn't act the right way. In fact, what's even more fascinating is that there are people that spent years with Jesus through his public ministry, and then even towards the very end of his public ministry, their faith still was not complete. There were huge gaps in what they understood about Jesus. And I think that's good sometimes to be reminded that Christ followers from the very beginning have been people like us that don't always get it right, and sometimes our brokenness spills out and we make mistakes. I also think it's interesting that even when you look at when the church was beginning to grow and being established in the first century, you see that over and over again, the Christians that came after the resurrection and after the cross and after everybody knew all this stuff, people that actually got to sit and talk with the disciples, they still messed things up to the point that the apostles wrote letters to these churches to encourage them, to teach them more about what it looked like to be a Christ follower. In fact, the Apostle Paul, who wrote the book of Colossians, which is a letter to the church at Colossae, that's what we're walking through in this series, Free to Be. In his letter to the Roman church, he actually talked about his own messed upness. And in Romans chapter 7, he said that there are things that he doesn't want to do that he does, and then he says there are things that he wants to do that he fails to do. And the Apostle Paul himself was struggling with the tension of being an imperfect follower of Christ and walking out what it looks like to be a Christ follower, being the kind of person that Jesus has called him to be. I think that's an interesting tension that we live with sometimes, and those of you that have made the decision to follow Christ, I think sometimes there's that question of how do we become the person that Christ wants us to become, and does he want us to become something, and should we become something? One of the messages I think that's common around Summit, and if you're a part of Summit, you know this is a message that we talk about all the time, and it's that Jesus didn't come to establish another world religion, but Jesus came to establish a way of relating to God relationally. And when I say that, I mean that religion is always defined by human beings coming up with elaborate systems of do's and don'ts and behavioral goals and objectives in order to somehow please God, earn his favor so that he'll love them. And Jesus does just the opposite. It's completely about what he does for us to show us God's love. And our response isn't one of fear, hoping to earn God's favor, but it's one of relationship and saying, you love me and I'm going to love you in return. That's a message that I think when we hear that resonates with us. It's something that I think you celebrate. And for me, I know because of some of my own personal history around the church and things that I was a part of early on, there's something liberating when you realize Jesus didn't come to establish religion. He came to establish relationship. There's something that's beautiful about that and wonderful about that. And I think when you hear that, you go, man, that's what I came to Christ for. I came to him because he was about something completely different than religion. But I think within that, there's a tension. And it's created because I think for most of us, if you think back to when you first started following Christ, when you first began the journey towards him and towards this life in Christ, certainly there were parts of it, and depending on when you were introduced to him, there were parts of it that, if you're like me, there were existential realities that you were trying to resolve. There were things about who we are as spiritual beings that I wanted to answer the questions to, and so there were philosophical dynamics to me becoming a Christ follower, and probably for you. But I think when you get back to the basics of the issue and you think about why people come to Christ and why you came to Christ and what often leads us to that place of eventually saying, I need something other than just me navigating this life alone, is that we recognize that there are things that are messed up in us. There are things that are broken in us. There are situations we find ourselves in and we think, man, I really wish my life didn't go this direction. I wish I didn't disintegrate relationships the way that I do. Or maybe we find ourselves engaged in behaviors that we wish we weren't. And so we walk out of those scenarios or situations and we look in the mirror and there's something about ourselves that we say, something's got to change. Like something has to give. We all come to Christ because at some point we realize there's a brokenness in us and we need something different. We need healing. We need some sort of change. The tension that exists in this is that when we understand, and I think this is a very real thing for us, and even in this church, I think the real tension sometimes is that if Jesus came to establish a relationship, and this whole thing is not about religious do's and don'ts, then how do we go about the change and the transformation that we sense we need? I think one of the problems, and I've experienced this in my own life, is that the trajectory of change, when I suddenly realize that I'm not earning God's favor, there are times I've kind of settled in and I think, well, God's good with me where I am, but I'm not good with where I am. So how do I take the next steps to see growth, to see those things take place in my life? And that's what Paul is trying to clarify in his letter to the church at Colossae. Here's a group of people that understood that there was something that needed to take place in their life. They recognized there was transformation that needed to be a part of their experience in Christ. And at the point in time in which this letter arrives on their doorstep, they were drifting back. They were gravitating back towards religiosity, towards legalism, towards laws and rules and do's and don'ts. And so Paul's looking at this situation, these juxtaposed ideas of, do we just sit in stagnancy or do we grow through religion? And he's saying, no, there's a whole different way for us to experience transformation. And that's what he's talking about in Colossians 3. Colossians 3, he's beginning to unpack what it looks like for you and I to live lives of transformation as a result of the gospel in our lives, not religion in our lives. So I want to pick up where we left off last week. Last week we were in chapter 3, and we went up to verse 4, and I want to just start in verse 5 this evening, and really just read the first section, and then we're going to walk through what Paul is saying. We're going to unpack this and really hope to understand it even more. This is what Paul says. He says, "Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you: sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. On account of these things, the wrath of God is coming. In these you too once walked when you were living in them, but now you must put them all away: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you've put off the old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator." Paul begins these verses, and where we start tonight is with an image or imagery that he's been using throughout this letter that I think is really interesting in light of what he's trying to talk about. Here we're looking at a group of people who are pursuing life to the full. That's what Jesus came to offer. Being a Christ follower means we are experiencing the fullness of life, living life the way that we were created to live life. What's fascinating is when Paul is writing to this church and he's trying to help them live this new life, there's this reoccurring theme of death that he keeps revisiting. It isn't an issue of what happens when you die or where do you go when you die. The issue of death is this idea of you and I having been living a particular sort of life, and then we died with Christ, and then we're resurrected to a new sort of life. And I think it's interesting that in the context of life, he keeps referring to this idea of death. Verse 5, he says, "Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you." So Paul's been saying this over and over again. He's been saying, listen, you're dead. You died with Christ. You were living a way of life that was empty and meaningless. And then when Christ was crucified and buried, you died with him. And this keeps being repeated over and over again. This is a theme for Paul that he keeps returning to. But now in verse 5, he adds something, the same death theme, but it's really fascinating when you think about what he's saying. You've died. You're dead. That life was over. And then he says, put to death what is earthly in you. When I read this, my first thought is, isn't there a contradiction here? I mean, if I'm dead, then what is there left to be put to death? What am I putting to death? If I'm dead, if there was an old me and now there's this new living me, then what is Paul saying when he says, be putting these things to death in your life? This right here, when we look at this seemingly contradictory statement, that really, I think, identifies the tension that we feel as Christ followers. The tension that exists when we know that there's something that's taken place spiritually on our behalf, and yet we still live life in this place where at times we don't exactly experience the sort of transformation or renewal that we expected we would experience when we chose to follow Christ. There's this tension that Paul is helping us understand, and he's actually not contradicting himself. He's actually revealing something that's really crucial and important for us to understand, and it's this. And if you're taking notes, this is something you might want to jot down or think about as it relates to your life. But what he's revealing is that there's a difference between what is spiritually true and what is experientially true. You catch that? There's a difference between what is spiritually true, the spiritual realities that we experience, and then what we actually experience in life. There's a difference between what we know to be true and then our experience that we walk out. Those two things don't necessarily run in a parallel relationship with one another. Now, in our culture, what we do, because of our culture and because of our sense of instant gratification and the way we want things to work immediately, we view this and immediately we see contradiction. In fact, we not only see contradiction, but for some of us, when we have this experience of a lack of parallel relationship between spiritual and actual real relation or real realities, when this happens, we have a tendency to point fingers and say, well, you see that, Jesus doesn't work then. Like the message of Jesus isn't, it should be authenticated because the moment I begin believing, there should be something that takes place and this is the way my life should look. We have that tendency to question the integrity of our faith or to call it out. And maybe we don't do that, on a major level. Maybe some of you just think, well, yeah, I keep praying and there's just not this. And I don't know how to deal with the fact that I just keep going back to those things. Some of you, maybe it's even bigger and that's the barrier between you trusting Christ. But what's fascinating is that this is one of the few places in life where we consider this a contradiction. In most other areas or most other ways, we actually, we don't consider that sort of thing a contradiction. Think about it this way. Let's say that you decide that you're going to pursue a particular career. But that career requires a level of education and certification and training before you can do it. So you sign up for classes, maybe you enroll in a school, maybe it's a trade, maybe it's some sort of profession that you're going to pursue, and you sign up for classes, and then you spend years, and you're going to sit with professors or sit with instructors, and you're absorbing information, and you're taking notes, and you're going to labs, and you're getting all of this information. You work and work and work and work, and you're working towards someone certifying you. There's a day that comes, if you're that sort of person, if you've ever gone down that road, there's a day that comes when after you've done all the work and you've got all these things, whether it's a certification or a degree of some sort, you get to that point, and when you graduate from the program, when you're done with it, you do this little thing called look for a job, right? And so you get your paper out and you start writing things down about yourself that sound way better than they really are, right? Like you just start making up brilliant things about who you are. You use vocabulary words you never used the previous 4 years of school, right? And you describe yourself, and then you send out your resume to people, and then eventually one of those people calls you, right? And they say, we want to interview you. And so you come in and you tell them, I went to school and here was what I did and here's the training that I've had and, I've passed the certifications and I've been approved. And they look at you and for whatever reason, they choose to believe you and they think you're competent. And so they say, you're hired. Anyone ever gone through this experience? Anyone? Okay, so a bunch of us have, right? Some of you are in the middle of this experience, right? And those of us that have gone through this experience, you did these things. You get the job, and maybe you get the business card, you get the title, you get the office, you get the spot in the shop, whatever it is, whatever it was you trained for, you get that spot. Do you remember your first day? Do you remember how unbelievably lost you were? I remember, like, midway through college, I wound up going to Bible college, and the first job I got was a youth pastor. The first day, I was like, these people have no idea what they've done. Like, I have no business doing this. Like, I was lost. I was a mess. Like, I had no idea. Although I had the certification and I had the title, there was this sense of nowhere near being competent or qualified. That's a normative experience for human beings. We know. We would look at that situation and we don't go, well, that's a contradiction. No, we go, actually, that's normal. You get the job, you get the title, maybe you've gotten to this certain point, but there's still experience to be gained as you begin to live this sort of thing out. The same thing happens in an athletic scenario. In an athletic scenario, you try out for a team, and when you make the team, what do? They tell you, you're the best player we've ever seen, right? No, usually you make the team and you barely make the team. And there's no guarantee that you're going to start right away, and there's no guarantee that you even know how to work with your teammates. You might spend a little while riding the pine while you figure out the systems of what it looks like to work on that team. You might be on the team, you might have the title of having made that team, but it doesn't mean that you're proficient or experienced in living as a teammate in that scenario. What's fascinating is we have no problem with that. We don't call that a contradiction. We just accept that as being normal. But when it comes to this spiritual reality that Paul's discussing, we have a tension in this because we want this spiritual truth that has now been proclaimed over us of once being dead and now being alive. We want that to have immediate results. Paul says to us in these verses, he says, listen, you're dead. There's a spiritual reality that's true about you. You are no longer defined by the life that you used to live. You're no longer bound by the limitations of that life. You're no longer caught up in living the way that life defined you in any capacity. At your core, you are no longer that person. You are somebody new. But you are not done. You're not done. What he's describing and what he's helping us understand is this process of Christ's story of resurrection and redemption becoming our story. What he's helping us understand and recognize is that we are making these spiritual realities, these spiritual truths, experientially true. He understands there's a process. We are actualizing spiritual reality. We're taking something that has happened and making it true now in our lives. And what we see from what he's saying is that we participate in this. We have a responsibility. There is an engagement on our part that makes this actually happen. How does it happen? What does he say? Well, immediately there's action that's given to this. He says that we put to death what is earthly in us. We put to death what is earthly in us. And there's this word picture. It's actually really interesting what he says and the way that he says this. He's using the terminology that simply describes the planet that we live on. He's using like geological sorts of references. The earth literally is a reference to the terra firma, the soil, the dirt that we walk in. And what he's painting a picture of is this sense that you and I walk this planet, and if we were to stand barefoot, we would feel the dirt between our toes. And the places where we stand and we feel the dirt between our toes, we find ourselves connected to those places. We find ourselves inhabiting those places. We find ourselves being citizens of those places. And what he's saying is in the same way you stand on the ground and you feel the dirt come around your feet, in the same way there's this place where who you are and the earth that you live on come together. There are spiritual realities, and when you stand in the things that you once lived in, the dirt comes around your toes and you're connecting yourself to that place, to the person that you used to be. And the picture that he's creating is one of us rising above that spot. No longer being grounded in that sort of way, no longer being connected to the things of a broken humanity, the things of an empty humanity, the things that disintegrated our life and wrecked our soul and ruined our emotions and stole our peace. He says, don't stand in that stuff anymore. Don't let those things be the place where you find yourself grounded. You are not who you used to be. So don't go on the way that you used to go on. And Paul lists out some things. It's really interesting. He says, I want you to put to death these things that you used to embed yourself in, these things that connected you to this earth. And in verse 5, he says, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you. And then he says this, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Something funny for me when I'm in this environment and I read this list. He starts with sexual immorality, and I look at that and I think about the context in which he's saying this, and I go, that makes sense. Impurity, that makes sense, yeah. Passion, specifically the word passion that he's using is lust. It's this idea of lustful passion. And he's saying, don't pursue that. And I go, okay, yeah, I think I can agree with that here. And then evil desires, and I just can't be okay with anything that's preceded by the word evil, so I have to agree with him on that one, right? It's not just desires, it's evil desires. And you go, well, I can't say that evil desires are good, right? And then he lumps in with all of this stuff, covetousness. And so if there's this little party that's like, well, I don't really have any sexual issues, but hey, every now and then I just like stuff. I like things. He goes, and covetousness. And in case you thought you could have a little bit of covetousness, he says, which is idolatry. You put things in the place of God. Here's what's interesting. When I look at this list and I think about what he says, listen, there's this place where you touch the ground. And the place where you touch the ground are all of these things: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and covetousness, which is idolatry. That's where your toes sink into the dirt. That connects you to this old life. And when I read that, I don't know if you feel this way, but when I read this, I look at this and I go, well, yeah. Like, no one sitting in church reads this list and objects with this. Right? Like, you just don't do that. I mean, it's pretty obvious. Like, when you think about the new life that Christ is offering you, not characterized by that old dead life, these are things that would never cross our mind. We would just go, okay, yeah, you're right. I agree with this. So the question is, well, if this is so obvious, then why does Paul go through the effort of naming them? Why is he specific? Why does he even have to point this out? Because this stuff sells really well, doesn't it? It doesn't in this room, but it does everywhere else. I mean, this, like sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desire, covetousness, it basically sounds like a good plot for a movie or a TV show, doesn't it? I mean, that's essentially what we watch all the time. It's how things are marketed to us, is through these same things. And I'm not saying by watching those things that we're buying those things, but I think the fact that they are so prevalent in our society should tell us something about the realness of the tension that we live in today. This should speak to something that here's a church a couple thousand years ago, and it was relevant to them in that point in time, and today we still find ourselves constantly being shown these things as entertainment, as ways of engaging and just using your mind in various ways. In fact, I would say we're even sold these things as a way to find meaning, right? Like if you're living your life and you're going through and you feel empty, and there's moments or days when you just suddenly feel like, man, I just don't feel whole, or I feel anxiety. I mean, when we want life to be a little bit more exciting or a little bit more adventurous, maybe it's because our sex life isn't what it could be. If you're a married person, maybe it's you look at the person that you're with in marriage and you think, well, this person isn't satisfying me in my marriage sexually, and so you think, well, I'm going to go pursue that with somebody else. I'm going to go find it because I should be satisfied sexually, and so I want to go find something that maybe is a little bit more fulfilling, and so we start thinking, maybe it's the sex thing. Maybe that's going to answer this thing. Or maybe it's just relationship stuff, and you think, well, this person's gotten boring. Our conversation, there's never anything new, and so he's really not the one, or she's not the one, and so we just start to abandon people in our life. Or maybe we just want some adventure, and so we're looking for something that'll just spice things up. I mean, there's a reason that things like midlife crisis have become stereotypes of 40-year-old men, right? Maybe you just think my situation, I just need a little bit more pleasure. I need to enjoy life. Or maybe you think, if I just got my stuff organized, or it all began to match, or it was all perfectly labeled, or it was all new, maybe then I would be better. what's interesting is that on paper we see these things listed and we go, well, that's silly. Nobody would really believe that. But in reality, it looks really tempting. So why does Paul mention these things? Does he mention these things for the sake of behavior modification because you're going to give Jesus a bad name? Christians shouldn't act like that. Here's what Christians should do. Is that why he's doing this? The reason that Paul is doing this, the reason he points these things out, is that each one of these things that he mentions is an opportunity for you and I to disbelieve the gospel. Each one of them represents a point in which we stop believing the gospel. We pursue these things. We go down these roads when we stop believing what the gospel says about us. When we don't fully understand that we're loved, and this is a significant issue, when suddenly we don't feel the love of people in our life, we don't experience the love of maybe a partner or a spouse in our life, when we begin to feel a lack of love in our life, we truly begin to pursue that in other capacities. And in that process, we forget what the gospel says about how much we're loved. We have the deepest desire for love, and the gospel says you are loved at the deepest level. And when we pursue that in other ways, we stop believing the gospel. When we stop believing that we have enough, the gospel shows us that we have enough. We don't need the respect or the praise of individuals around us. We simply need to acknowledge the fact that Christ gives us all that is required. We are respected and loved by our God. When we forget that reality, what do? We go chasing people's approval, and we look for ways for people to say they like us, for people to approve of our behavior, for people to say, you're okay, I like you, or I think you're great to be with. We pursue material things. We don't think we're complete, and when we don't believe we're complete, what are we saying? We're saying the gospel wasn't enough, and so we're grasping for things to try to fill this emptiness that we have inside of us. When we feel that emptiness, Paul's mentioning this, when we feel that emptiness, he's mentioning this because these are the things that we run to. This is the knee-jerk reaction. This is why it still sells, because when we feel empty, this is where we go. And he says, when you do, you're embedding your toes in the silt of the old life. And it doesn't make any sense. You're not living the new life, the alive life. You may be alive, but you're living like a dead person. That brings all the perspective in the world to verse 6. Verse 6 says something really interesting that I think our culture today struggles with because it talks about the wrath of God. And I think when you understand the context of these verses, you also understand the context of God's wrath, and it makes incredible sense to us. But in verse 6, as he continues, he says, put these things to death. And then he says, on account of these, the wrath of God is coming. That word wrath is really interesting, and this is kind of a side note, but the word wrath, the New Testament is written in Greek and then translated into English. And for whatever reason, the English translators always translate this word in Greek when it applies to God. They use the word wrath. Like, here's why it's interesting. When it applies to people, we call it anger. When it applies to God, we call it wrath. And they're the exact same word. They're both angry, but for whatever reason, like people that translate the Bible to English, we must think God's a lot madder than like everybody else. Even more so than those that wrote it in Greek, because they were like, God gets angry, and we're like, no, God gets wrathful. Like God's really mad, right? But what's interesting about this, I think one of the struggles that we have in our culture is, well, how does God, like, and I know people that struggle with this. They struggle with, how can a God that's loving be angry? And I know people that's one of the hang-ups for them on why they can't trust God or believe the message of Jesus, is because they look at the Bible and they say, well, how can a wrathful God also be a loving God? Like there's this tension. And I know people, maybe some of you struggle with this, or maybe you know somebody and this is their hang-up. Like they read verses like this one, they go, really? So you want me to love a God whose wrath is coming towards us because like is that what you want? And I think it's funny that we struggle so much when it comes to God having anger and wrath, But we have no problem when it comes to this being applied to humanity. Like, this is a tension that exists only when we think about God, because we have these expectations of God being a loving God that are completely incorrect. Like, let me just give you this example. As a dad, if I come home and I walk into my house, let's say my wife and I are out on a date and our kids are old enough now, we don't have babysitters, so they just hang out, and it's kind of like wild animals sometimes in our house. But imagine that we come home from a date and I open the door and when we walk inside, we discover that our children have been at war with one another. I do have all girls. It can happen, right? Let's say they've been clawing at each other and pulling each other's hair, and they've been hurling obscenities, and they've been saying things like, I hate you, and they're calling each other out, and there's just misery. As a dad, if I walk into that scenario, as a loving dad who sees his children, what's my response to that? Oh, guys, you knuckleheads, I love you, give them a noogie, just like, okay, we're good. No, I lose it, right? I lose it because I walk in and I see like mascara running down faces and I see claw marks and I'm just like, no, like what are you doing, right? Like it grieves me. It grieves me to see my children hurting one another, hurting themselves and wounding and creating this environment of dysfunction and pain. That's something that drives me crazy. Like it's the last thing that I want to see with my children. I mean, imagine if there were parents where two kids got in a fight and the mom and dad said, quick, get the camera in the chairs. We got a front row seat, right? We would look at that and we would say, that's incredibly dysfunctional. Like, how could two parents, we would look at parents that would watch their children fight and hurt one another, and we would say, you don't love your children, because a loving parent would be furious with that sort of behavior. So doesn't it seem to make sense that a God who is ultimately love, who is loving, would look at his children and the way they dehumanize one another, the way they turn sex into a commodity, the way that they wound each other, the way that they break each other, the way that they live without joy and without peace? Don't you think that when God looks at that there's anger, that it's like, why are you doing this to each other? Why do you hurt each other? See, love and wrath are the opposite sides of the same coin. They go together. The more loving you are, the more angry you will be when those you love are living in dysfunction and pain and heartache. And so Paul says, put this stuff to death, not because God's going to get you, but because this grieves him. This breaks the Father's heart when he sees us this way. And it's not who you are anymore. You don't have to live this way. That's what verse 7 is all about. He says, in these things, in this way, you once walked when you were living in them. The word walk, whenever you see it in the New Testament, and whenever you see it in Paul's writing, most frequently, the way that it's being used is in reference to the manner in which you live your life. Last week, right before these verses, we were looking at the word seek, and we were talking about how when Paul used the word seek, it literally had to do with the will of a man or the will of a woman, how you set the course for your life, how you determine where you're going, where you'll find purpose, where you'll find meaning. This idea of walking is a manner of living that's related to the same thing. He's saying this is the way that you find your identity or your purpose or your reason for being. Maybe your attempt to fill that gap when you feel empty. That's the way that you walk. And here's one of the most beautiful things that we find in this entire letter to this church. He uses the past tense to describe us. Here he is talking to these people and he's saying, put these things to death, but when it comes to defining the way we live our life, he separates the way we're behaving from who we are. And says, you once walked in these things. This is how you used to live your life, but it's not true of you today. You were living in them. This is the only way you found meaning, but that's not who you are. And so in one breath, he's telling us to put these things to death, and in the next breath, he's saying, but those things that you do, they don't define you. They aren't who you are. You're not defined by those behaviors. He's saying you no longer are the sum of your parts. You are no longer defined by these behavioral moments. There's a difference between walking in them and doing them. And now you're just doing them, but it's not who you are. It's not your identity. When I was a kid, I shared this a few weeks ago, I swam a lot because I grew up in Arizona. It's what you do. But then I started swimming competitively. And some of you know bits and pieces of this story. But in high school, I discovered I was pretty fast. And so swam even more and more. And in fact, at the height of, well, really all through high school and into college, it was 2 practices a day, 5 days a week, and a practice on Saturday. And I spent more time, I think, in the pool than anywhere else. And eventually was successful enough in high school that I was offered scholarships, and I went to college, and I was a collegiate swimmer. And my freshman year, there was a moment that I'll never forget of realizing. Remember this one day I was swimming, swimming is the most boring sport on the planet, by the way. Like, it's only in the Olympics because we can only handle it once every 4 years. And the training is even worse because you just go back and forth. And all you do as a swimmer is just stare at a black line on the bottom of the pool, and you're alone with your thoughts. And here I was, a freshman in college, and I've been wildly successful, and I'm staring at the bottom of the pool, and I realize I am incredibly empty. And I recognize that the reason I was empty was that I had made swimming, I had made this career an ultimate thing. I had made it my life. I had made it my God, and it became an idol to me. I don't know that I had the vocabulary for it at the time. I don't know that I could have articulated it that way. I just knew that I had put everything, all of my eggs in this basket, and I came up wanting every time. And so I did something absolutely radical about it. And I'll never forget being in my dorm room on this university campus and just praying and seeking God truly for the first time in my life, genuinely seeking God. And I made the decision to walk away from my swimming career. And disappointed all kinds of people in my life, and coaches and friends, and everybody was shocked. And I moved back home, and I was just trying to figure out, what am I going to do? Because this is all I've done. This is all I know. And I joined a gym. I joined a 24-hour fitness in Glendale, Arizona. And I'd go work out. I tried to work out, not as obsessively as previously. And then there was this one day I decided I wanted to go for a swim because there was a pool there. So I go down to the pool and I get my gear on and I start swimming. And this is a memory that I'll never forget. As I'm swimming, every time I take a breath, and the longer I swim, the more I'm acknowledging and seeing that the people that are also around the pool area are watching me swim. And there was this little thing inside of me that started to rise up, and I was like, I know why you're watching. Because I am so much faster than these balding middle-aged guys training for a triathlon, right? I knew it. And so I'm swimming, and I'm starting to feel good about the fact that people are watching me swim. I'm starting to realize, and so sure enough, I get done, and there are people that come over, and there's this one guy that comes over and goes, all right, who are you? Who are you? What do you do? Who are you? And there was a crisis in my soul. Because my answer to that question for all of my life had been, I'm a swimmer. And now I wasn't. Now I'm a Christ follower who's going for a swim. And I didn't know what to say. All of a sudden, I found myself in this moment of realizing, my identity was this, and now that someone's asking me who I am or what I do, I don't know how to answer the question. I'm a Christ follower, but I don't know what to say to you because that's all I've ever known. It's all I've been. And now I'm just swimming. Swimming isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing, right? Fall out of a boat, you'll discover, you should know how to swim. Nothing wrong with swimming, but now I was living in this tension of I used to be something and now I'm not, and what does it look like? And I can still swim, but does it mean that that's my identity? No, it's not my identity anymore. And the Apostle Paul looks at us and he says, listen, you are no longer who you used to be. You once walked in these things. It was who you were, but now you're the incarnation of truth. You're a visible picture of the resurrection. You're a statement to this world and the world that everybody's living in that says you don't have to go this way. That's who you are. We make the truth come to life. We put the truth in 3 dimensions that people can touch and see and experience. That's why we're here. And so Paul, he's clarifying this. He's proclaiming this about who we are. He's redefining who we are. And then he continues, I think, with this beautiful illustration. In fact, next week we're going to unpack this even more. But in verse 8, he continues and he says, "But you must now put them all away. Anger and wrath and malice and slander and obscene talk from your mouth." Basically, he's saying, if you didn't covet and you didn't have sexual issues, I'm going to make sure you know that you were still a broken person. Then in verse 9, he says, "Do not lie to one another." And then here's the beautiful part. "Seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator." The illustration that Paul uses that we're going to dive into is this idea of just simply getting dressed. It's like Paul is saying, this is what not to wear. What he's saying is that the clothes don't make the man. The clothes don't define you. You are not what you're wearing. The clothes don't make the man. The clothes don't make the woman. But sometimes the clothes, they don't make sense. Sometimes what you're wearing doesn't make sense. That's what he's pointing out. A couple of weeks ago, I stepped up my game in terms of like how I was getting like dressed during the week. Does that sound like an adult thing to say? I don't know how to say that other than just like I turned over a new leaf and I thought, you know what? I need to be a little bit more professional during the week when I come into the office. And not that I was a slob. In fact, I usually dressed like this. So when I stepped up my game, I was dressing a little bit nicer. And so it was fascinating because 2 weeks ago, I ran into some people out in public and they looked at me and they were like, what are you doing? And I was like, well, I'm at work. I'm at the office. Like, I go to work. And they said, well, you look nicer during the week than you do on Sunday. And I said, well, at Sunday, I'm at church. And right now I'm at work. And that didn't help them at all. They were like, well, what? Like, this doesn't make any sense to me. And then this last week, same thing. I was just dressing a little bit nicer, not a whole lot nicer, but there was one day I decided to put a tie on underneath a sweater. And I think like 14 people that day asked me if I had a court date. Like all day, people were like, you got a meeting, you're going to court, like what's happening, And then there was another day, same thing happened. So finally on Thursday, like I was just like, well, I'm going to wear jeans and, I'm going to dress like this. And I showed up and I walked up to my office and Nick and I, we share an office here in the building. And I walked in the office and Nick looks at me, looks up and down, and he goes, "That's better," and went back to work. Because it didn't make sense, right? There was this disconnect, like, what are you doing? Like, there's what you're wearing, and then there's what you always, like, who you are, and there was, like, something that didn't resonate, and that's exactly what Paul's saying in these verses, as ridiculous as that may sound. He's saying, all this broken and disintegrating and messed up stuff that you're being characterized by, that you're living in, those are like worn-out clothes that don't make sense with who you are today. You're like, man, this is like tattered old stuff that should be tossed, it should be burned. Put on the new you. That's what he's saying. Put on the new self, which is being renewed. There's this idea of being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. There's one final part of the vocabulary of these verses that I think is really, really wonderful for us to realize. The language of this verse, he says, this new self that we're living in, which is being renewed. That speaks to process. That speaks to not being done. That speaks to you and I being in a situation that says, you're not done. You're not the sum of your deeds, and you're in process. You are being renewed. You are being made new in the present. And so, yes, there's a spiritual reality, but now there is an experiential reality. And in this experiential reality, you are becoming a new person. You are cultivating the new self. You are cultivating the new life that you have in Christ. There is something that's been planted in you. The gospel has been planted in your soul. The reality of who God believes you to be has been placed inside of you. And now you are growing in that gospel reality. And you're becoming the person that the gospel says you are. you're being shaped, you're being transformed. And once again, Paul in this moment, he connects the transformation to the mind, to what we know. In the previous verses that we looked at last week, he said, seek the things above and set your mind on things above. In the book of Romans, he says that we should be transformed by the renewing of our mind, this cultivation of the new life, this transformation that we experience. It happens when our mind is focused on the gospel, when we return to who Christ is and the truths of what he says about us. That's where we experience transformation. He's bringing us back to where we are. And our transformation is the byproduct of understanding what the gospel says about us. And that's what transforms us. So this isn't an issue of, well, I guess I'm just okay with who I am, because that's what Jesus says. And this isn't an issue of religion. It's religion. And the reason he's saying this is that religion, as much as we want to change, as much as we know there's transformation that needs to happen, religion never really changes us. It never sets us free. Religion's like a person who trains their dog to stay. You know when you meet people who have dogs, like usually like for me, it's like guys that hunt. And they got dogs that they have that hunt, but you never see. They actually, all these guys I know, they have dogs that they supposedly hunt with, but they never go use them. I don't know. It was just a cool guy thing to have, right? Got to have a hunting dog. And there's always this moment when you're hanging out with these guys and their dogs when they're like, hey, watch this. And they pull out, something that smells so much like bacon that I'm interested in it, right? Like, hey, check this out. They pull this thing out, and I'm like, are you sure that's not bacon? Because it looks good, right? And they take it and they go, stay, and they chuck it. They throw it down the driveway or wherever it is, and they look at the dog and they say, stay. And then the guys that have really done a great job of training their dog, they'll look back at you and then they'll just start conversation. They'll be like, hey, watch this. And they just start talking about nothing, right? Meanwhile, the dog's over here having convulsions, right? Just like looking down the driveway like, come on, like look at you, look at the treat, look at you, look at the treat, right? They're back and forth, and the guy's just sitting there, and he's talking, and the dog is just fixated, right? Waiting for that moment when he'll just say, okay. And what does the dog do? Bolts down the driveway and gets it as quickly as it can. That is a picture of religion. Religion tells us, stay. And we're not free, are we? We're sitting and all we can do is look and think, oh man, should I, shouldn't I? Am I allowed to? Am I not allowed to? What am I going to do? And we're just waiting. Then there's that moment when it feels like for whatever reason, we either give up or we're not obedient enough, or we just feel like somebody says okay and we dart towards it. And then we have these moments of feeling anything but free. For once, I'd love to see the dog just look at that thing and go, and walk away, right? Just crush that duck hunter, right? No. Because that's what it looks like when you and I are redeemed and released and renewed by the gospel. Am I right? See, this isn't about us growing by trying to achieve something or get something that we don't already have. This is about us growing by living out the truth that truly defines us. This is about us living in the reality of who we already are. And that is what truly liberates us. It's not about effort, not about rules, not about it's about you and I saying, what does the gospel say about me? And I no longer have to pursue these things. And I can experience transformation. It doesn't mean the tension isn't there. It doesn't mean that there aren't moments when we're going through our days and we glance over and there's that bacon treat over off to the side. Paul continually uses the tension of the old self and the new self. In fact, I love that he does that because I have friends in my life that sometimes say things like this to me. They say, well, I just need to be true to myself. And the question I ask them is, which one? Because as a Christ follower, what we're being called to is to be true to the new self, because the old self has died and is buried with Christ, and the new self has been resurrected. Amen? We are free to be in process. We are free to be renewed. And we have to continue to immerse ourselves in the gospel It's why we spend time together like this. It's why we constantly come back to the gospel, because that's what changes us. It's why Nick goes on about community groups, because we need gospel community. We don't need more friends. I'll be the first person to say that, but you know what I do need? I do need people who understand that there's a new self that Brad Williams should be pushing towards, and they're encouraging me towards it, and them towards their new self. There's a reason that I need to spend time in the Word and be reading and praying through the middle of the week. It isn't so that religiously I'll somehow make God happier with me. It's because, I don't know about you, but just about every day I wrestle with emptiness, a lack of adventure, my insecurity, my brokenness, and I need to be reminded constantly, who do you say I am? What does the gospel say about me? We immerse ourselves in the gospel, and we continue in this process of becoming more and more whole and more the person Christ created us to be. Let's pray. Jesus, I just want to thank you for liberating us from religiosity, for setting us free from the prison of religious behaviors, and then at the same time challenging us to no longer live a dead self, wearing behaviors and activities that lead us into an empty, meaningless life. Lord, I thank you that what you promise us about life is something you show us the way towards. You didn't just say there's life and life to the full and then just leave us and go, hope you get it. But you showed us, you told us about it, and then you lead us in that. You walk us through that. So I pray, Lord, that you would remind us of what you have said about us, that we would allow your gospel to penetrate our hearts and our lives, and that we would experience the kind of wholeness and life-giving freedom that comes with the new life that's found in you. We love you, Lord. We pray this in your name.